right? Now, as we said, Multitude was a follow-on text to Empire. And in Empire, we were starting to talk about what it means to have this biopolitical type civilization that Foucault was talking about, generalized out over the entirety of globalization. And it was a challenge, as we argued then, to Francis Fukuyama. And the problem, of course, is that Empire, was written in 2000, right before, just about a year before 9/11 happened. And so when people read Empire, they loved it, and of course many people in Seattle, those types of protesters, the anti-globalization protesters, really took up Empire as a very important book, and they liked it, and they believed that it had, they believed that Empire was kind of a wonderful book in terms of its ability to predict for us and anticipate for us the kinds of problems that we were going to have politically in globalization. But then, of course, 9/11 happens, and 9/11 seems to change the game, because Empire had been saying, there's no more such thing as the nation state, imperialism is over, all we have is the global empire, and capitalism and democracy kind of, instead of being what they promised they would be, have actually turned out to be very violent and not very fair to a lot of people, not very fair to the environment and that kind of thing. So this kind of disappointment then causes Hartenegri to write Empire, but Empire then a year later with 9/11 seems to be kind of a flawed book, because 9/11 seems to bring about a return of America, right? America's back. It's shook off the Vietnam syndrome that many people said ended any American chance of ever being an empire. The empire, the empire that seems to be coming into existence after 9/11 is decidedly American, because America went so unilateral in its efforts to try to respond to the events of 9/11. It invaded Afghanistan, it invaded Iraq, it invaded them with only a handful of allies, a very stark contrast to the earlier, much more empire-looking response of George Bush Sr. to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait that marked the first Gulf War, where literally every nation on earth lined up to send in some kind of contingent or group to counter the menace of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So if the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, was a war of empire, the second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, the Iraq War, seemed to be a war, an imperial war, much more than an empire war. And so many people then criticized Hartenegri for being too quick in many ways to make their argument, right? They had overreacted. They had moved too quickly, in so many words, and overgeneralized from tendencies that were ongoing, which they had no real right to, and they were inappropriate to make those arguments. But Multitude is a book they get working on, and it comes out later in the decade. Let me just check here in my copy of the book when it was actually published, 2004. So obviously Iraq gets invaded in 2003. This comes out in 2004. What's Multitude saying? Is it capitulating? Is it an apology for empire? Are they saying we're sorry we wrote that book? In fact, no. They do say that perhaps they were a little too hasty in writing Empire, because they should have seen some of these potentially old style warfare techniques still lingering on. But generally, they were very content with what they wrote, and they were very happy with a lot of the key concepts they wrote. And if anything, what they were suggesting was that by 2004, which is 3 years really into the events of 9/11 and the war on terror with the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, what was becoming very obvious was that America's reaction to 9/11 was a complete failure, a catastrophe, if you will. The efforts to engineer a new society in Iraq were completely failing because the insurgency was so strong, and Afghanistan seemed to be a total catastrophe as well, because there was no real way to understand or measure in a tribal society where it wasn't even clear who the terrorists were or who the bad guys were, how you would win. You couldn't exactly measure the amount of enemy soldiers you were killing, because effectively the line between civilian and soldier in Afghanistan was very blurry. They said basically that, if anything, what 9/11 proved was that unilateralism was no longer possible in that old way. That nation states really could not go to war anymore. That America, they said, cost America a lot of money, a lot of blood, a lot of treasure, and really it had gotten America nowhere. So it wasn't a solution, and I think they would sort of still stick with that hypothesis even today, despite the fact that the so-called surge has produced some successful outcomes in Iraq. It's still proven to be a hugely expensive war, and America can never do this again. Not that it might not want to, but it can't. I mean, the country is very much in debt. There's never been a suggestion that the country would have to raise taxes to pay for war. Normally you do have to raise taxes to pay for war. Wars aren't cheap, but instead American taxes have gone down. George Bush Jr. Dropped the tax rates on the richest Americans. So no wonder the debt has skyrocketed. Joseph Stiglitz separately has talked about the wars since 9/11 as being $4 trillion wars, right, when all is said and done. So that's, even though America is a very big country, those wars are very, very expensive, and they really will change the debt profile of the country for decades and decades to come. So one other thing they sort of talk about then in the preface to Multitude, which really is sort of the bridging point where they talk about their reflections on the book they wrote in Empire, their understanding of where the Empire hypothesis stands today, what they want to take back, what they want to stay with. It's clear that they don't necessarily believe that they've got much to apologize for, but one subject that they're particularly emphatic about, but that they feel that they did not elaborate enough in the first book, was this concept of the multitude. So really this book is about the multitude. It's about how to try to create a subject that can live in global peace and harmony. And I'll have to explain a lot about this in a minute, but one of the things about the book, though, is that they say that before they can discuss the multitude, they're going to have to get to grips with the nature of the war that is going on in the world at the moment. The war, of course, being a very broad and vague term, but they believe that the war is going on. And what is the war? Well, the war is the war of empire. And it is something that's hard to get your head around if you're stuck in the old paradigm of thinking about wars as being wars between nation states. That's not the nature of this war. This is a war that is grounded and rooted in a different kind of set of processes than the type of processes that we're used to. So we have to keep that in mind. But just to wrap up the preface, they ask that we have patience, because their book is going to use a lot of language that maybe is difficult to understand, especially in relation to the multitude. So, for example, in the preface, they've talked already about a couple of tricky things like the economic and the political aspects of the multitude. The economic aspect, of course, is that in an age, you might say, of information technology and information technology-based labor, where workers today in the sort of global factories aren't just producing cars or candy or clothes anymore, but they're increasingly doing those things through the auspices of technology. And they're also doing stuff online as well. They're creating online factories, right? Creating value through online work. There are call centers, for example, in India that are highly technologized, where people are actually quite poor, but they're trained to work in these call centers and put on American accents and respond to our phone calls when we can't figure out how to turn our computer on and that kind of thing. So we live in an age where knowledge, information, coding, all of these things are the capacities of the laboring subject today. And then, most interestingly of all, caring, right? You may remember a famous quote that I sometimes cite, that Henry Ford had said that, oh, Americans can buy any color Model T Ford they like so long as it's black. And that was the old attitude of the capitalist, you know. He didn't necessarily really care about your tastes. He wanted to make a damn good car and then sell it to everyone. And everyone should be happy with that car that he was selling, right? But now today, of course, we see that you can have a car in any color you want. Everything can be customized and modified. So capitalism today is very different to Henry Ford's capitalism. In fact, we can talk about it as post-Fordist capitalism if you want. And that's a term that Hart and Negri use sometimes to talk about the type of capitalism that exists in empire. But also the type of capitalism that has brought into existence this thing called the multitude, because its economic power, the multitude's economic skill, its skill at making value is always caught up with this information, this .com stuff, this information technology stuff, but above all, this caring stuff, right? So I sometimes give the example, and I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here, I sometimes give the example of the sex chat worker, right? And the sex chat phone worker is the type of worker that wants to how should I say, anticipate the needs of the caller, right? The caller might have any type of sexual taste you could care to imagine, but the sex chat phone worker has to be kind of, in distinction to the worker that worked in Henry Ford's Model T assembly line, which was just sticking rivets on a piece of metal all day long. And you had one place in the assembly line. Look at the assembly line that's constituted by the sex chat phone worker. This is someone who's not just doing the same old linear thing over and over. This is a non-linear type of labor, a labor based on an anticipation that what we start off selling might not be what we end up selling, depending on what the caller wants, right? So the caller might be into some kind of weird kinky thing that the person on the other end of the phone's never heard of before. So that person, the worker, has to anticipate this, respond to it, and adapt to it in order to provide an authentic experience for the caller, the consumer, in other words. So that kind of really, to me, always in a nutshell, bespeaks the economic capacities of the multitude, right? The new worker, the new laborer, has all these potentials. And so the multitude, if it exists, this is Hart and Negri's point, is uniquely enabled as a caring population or a body of caring individuals because it's got all this experience working with care. And so that's very important for us. Then we also have this political aspect, a tendency towards ever more flat forms of globalization. One of the things that we see in the protests that have emerged since the fall of the Berlin Wall is an increasing tendency on the part of the protesters to organize themselves horizontally, right? Used to be people would organize vertically in unions, and there'd be a union boss and union middle management and the union bottom level. But if we look at the Occupy demonstrations, for example, that happened last year, or we look at the Tahrir Square phenomena in Egypt and the so-called Arab Spring, we find that people are increasingly organizing themselves through information technologies like Twitter and Facebook, and this is allowing them to go flat, to go horizontal. They don't need leaders anymore, and so they're borrowing from old anarchist techniques for organizing themselves, using these old anarchistic style, horizontally integrated modes of organization. So that's two things we can say then about the multitude in terms of its nature, that it is on the one hand caring and has a lot of skill in care and love, if you want to put it in those terms, and then on the other hand that it is political, that it has these political tendencies that are horizontal, and both of those things tell Hart and Negri a little bit about what's going on here, the clash between political power and political sort of emancipation, and so this is the nature of the book, right? And so the book hesitates before discussing multitude then to discuss the imperial side of things, right? And how empire went from being empire to what we now see as being post 9/11, this sort of permanent global war, that things really got cranked up after 9/11. And one of the things that they're anticipating here is that through this figure they mention early on in chapter 1 is this figure called Simplicissimus, who is a sort of a desperate figure, maybe a slightly simpleton type figure, but to whom all wars look the same. Armies come and go, militants come and go, but all the wars look the same. And I think they're suggesting that Simplicissimus is in fact wrong, that there is a new type of war going on, and it's worth being particular about it because it tells us a lot about what the multitude are going to have to fight against if they want to emancipate themselves and experience true democracy in the world today. To understand the specificity then of the current war, you have to understand this concept of the exception. And I think they make a really good point here about this. They talk about two types of exception, and I'll give you my little spin down on those now. If we look back historically, you guys will have, maybe some of you taken class with me before, we talked about realism, for example, in my international relations class or in my foreign policy class. And we know realism comes out of 1648, and in 1648, of course, we had the Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, which was an agreement struck after the 100 Years' War, that nation states would put aside their religious differences and agree to respect each other's sovereignty. And after that to say, look, Caius Regio, eius religio, and that's what's cited in Hardinegri, that to whomever is the king, so goes the religion. And what this meant was that with the emergence of Protestantism and the potential for conflict that Protestantism brought with it, because of course there you could have Catholic kings persecuting minorities of Protestant persuasion or vice versa, and the tendency then for nation states to get caught up in these long wars about religious morality and religious freedom. Westphalia kind of, and in 1648, put all this on the shelf, where the nation states basically agreed to become what we call realist, or to embrace realpolitik, which is kind of a cool term. It enables us to understand how, in a sense, war was put under arrest by law. Okay, that the politicians embraced the law and put war under arrest. And ever since then we have this idea of an exception, that the law is able to be so strong. If I'm losing my words here a little bit because I'm trying to say something very specific about this. I'm trying to relate realism to the exception, and I think what I want to say is that realism, by sort of putting war under arrest and under the auspices or the jurisdiction of the nation state as a body that is somehow juridically or legally separate to the whim of the church or the whim of the king, needed to have at its disposal something called the exception in order to be able to prevent this system from ever breaking down again, to prevent Westphalia from ever breaking down again. Sovereignty had to be paramount, had to be secured paramountly. You couldn't have any subgroup within the nation state coming up, rising up, overthrowing the state, and going back to the days of radicalism. So in order for there to be realism, every nation state needs responsible sovereignty. And so we call, for Hardinegri, this is German exceptionalism, because it's based, they derive most of their understanding of it from the German juridical theorist from around about the time of World War II, Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt basically said that the sovereignty is the thing that allows the nation state to determine who the friend is and who the enemy is. And sometimes, of course, the friend is external. Sometimes the friend is internal. And conversely, for the enemy, the same is true. You can have internal and external enemies. But if the nation state, if the sovereign is under threat by these enemies, the normal freedoms of the state can be suspended. in an exceptional moment, you might say, just as the Emperor Cincinnatus did, and they describe this in the book. Cincinnatus, the Roman emperor, took power. He was a general who took power to restore order in Roman. Excuse me, I may have said Germany. Cincinnatus was a Roman general who took power in order to prevent a crisis from happening. And once order and peace had been restored, then 14 days later or something, he resigns. He goes back to the farm and he retires, and he does not keep the power, right? So this was what George Washington was afraid of as well, when George Washington renounced the idea of being president for more than 4 years. He just wanted to be president for, he said, and after that, basically there's this tradition that American presidents should not be presidents longer than two 4-year periods. And the only president I think that's ever not done that was who? The New Deal, not Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt. So this idea is, of course, the ideal idea, right, of the exception from the German approach, but it doesn't always play out, and sometimes, of course, as we know, powers that come to power in the time of exception are very hesitant and slow to give it back once the conflict is over, and that's unfortunate, but it's the way it is. So we have to contend with the American exception now, which is very, very different to the German exception. This is kind of more like a sociological phenomena, where Americans think of themselves as the people who live in the shining city on the hill, as Reagan put it, and who are the beacon of hope to people all over the world, that America is the best democracy money can buy, and everyone wants to be American because only in America is freedom truly enshrined in the Constitution, which of course is just not true. There's many, many, many other countries that have great deal more freedom than America. So America is certainly something of a free country, but it's not the most free country. Yet Americans tend to think that it is, and they think that they are the exception to the rule. So goes the theory, and by virtue of that, then if America ever attacks someone or invades someone, they're doing it not out of aggression, but they're doing it for the good of the people who live in that country, i.e. to liberate them from a dictator or to set things right, for global democracy. As Woodrow Wilson said on the eve of America going into World War I, we're going into this war to make the world safer for everyone. We're going into the war to make the world safe for democracy. So obviously there's a suggestion here of a kind of an odd thing that if America determines that a war needs to happen, then a war shall happen. And why should a war happen? Because America is strong. And here then there's this sense of a kind of a might makes right vision. And of course it undermines, if America is allowed to just invade anyone it wants because it is strong and righteous, then indeed it sort of undermines the autonomous vision of the founding fathers of the country. They were so preoccupied with the idea of fighting against the British so that the Americans could have a freedom to determine for themselves how they wanted to live. Ironically, American foreign policy suggests that Americans today don't live by that edict all too well or all that often. So we have a couple of other things to talk about, and certainly we can get to them soon, but we're coming up on an hour long in the lecture, and I don't really want to go much more over that. So let me just hit on a few things here. 3 consequences of reversing Clausewitz. Who was Clausewitz? Clausewitz was a German military theorist. In fact, he was a Prussian military theorist, and it is often said that he was the first person who ever really took seriously the idea of an academic or scientific study of military strategy. Obviously, there'd been military strategists long before Clausewitz, but Clausewitz thought that you could apply the principles of science to strategy, and that's very interesting. And one of the things that Clausewitz saw when he looked at military conflict in his time was the idea that, and remember, we're living in the realist era at this stage, right? So what he saw was that wars were really just an extension of the politics of a nation state, just fought out by other means, right? So when 2 nation states might have a problem with each other, but they could go to war with each other, their options for resolving the dispute were that they could either go to war with each other, or they could resolve their disputes peacefully or politically. So a peaceful or political approach to solving a dispute is ideal, I suppose. But if nation states do have to go to war, the thing, says Clausewitz, that we have to remember is war is not just war, all-out war. It's not war for the purpose of annihilating the enemy or war for the purpose of annihilating ourselves. We don't want to take our war to the point where we're exhausted, right? War is constrained by politics, and war is constrained by the edicts and desires of the nation state. But we have, and Hart and Negri have so far been discussing, and even Fukuyama was discussing, the fact that we now increasingly live in globalization. And globalization does put a check on the power of the nation state. For Hart and Negri, it puts a very serious check on the power of the nation state because, of course, every nation state today is really just an apparatus of the global empire and the global empire's desires. So that's an interesting question for us. What does that mean for Clausewitz? If Clausewitz was saying war was the extension of politics of the nation state by another means, then if the nation state is not anymore in charge of war, but empire is in charge of war, and war seems to be everywhere now, then we have to contend with the possibility that it might be time to reverse Clausewitz, that we, instead of saying that war is an extension of politics, we can say that politics is an extension of war. And I really want you guys to hold that into your mind, because if I've said anything in this lecture that's worth anything at all, it's that reversal that is central to Hart and Negri's argument, right? That politics may today be the extension of war, right? In other words, what do they mean by that? That politics today, if we look around us and we see what's going on, if we see how, for example, our societies are becoming so militarized and how our policing is starting to look more and more like military activity, but carried out in the name of things that justifications that sound kind of like police activity. I mean, just consider, for example, the fact right now that they have this vigilante in LA, a former police officer, who is apparently today is the first person to ever have warranted the deployment of a drone in the activity of trying to detain or prosecute and arrest or take out, assassinate a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, right? That's really quite remarkable, right? So drones are usually considered to be military tools, right? But we're now using that domestically in order to carry out a police action. So there's a real blurring between military and police style activities here now. But the justification that we're giving for our military/police activities is increasingly moralistic. It's not legalistic, right? So back in the age of Clausewitz, we had international law, right? The law that was agreed between states internationally, right? But today in empire, where the nation states are the tools increasingly of this global phenomena called empire, then what do we call this, right? We have a breakdown of international law because clearly the norms and values of international law are compromised almost every day now. We have all kinds of interventions that are considered normal that were not agreed or justified through the normal auspices through which international law would allow invasion. For example, consider the way the United Nations gave authorization for the Korean War to take place, right? You don't see that happening in terms of the invasion of Iraq. Iraq happened on the basis of a moral argument given by the United States government vis-a-vis weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't a legalistic argument, right? Because Iraq hadn't really broken any laws and they couldn't prove it. And in fact, now when we look back, apparently a lot of this information was either faked or faked in bad faith or faked in good faith. It doesn't really matter, but either way, the evidence that Colin Powell presented before the UN was incorrect. A lot of the weapons inspectors suggested that was the case, and it was very, very obvious around about 2003 that the UN was not going to issue a mandate for a forcible decapitation of the Iraqi regime, which is what the Americans wanted. So where does this leave us? It's very, very confusing. We have a breakdown in international law. That's one thing we can say for certain. And that means that, or so our argument's going, instead of having the type of Clausewitz that we typically would talk about, where war was the extension of politics, now politics is the extension of war. And what we mean by that is that war is no longer war between nation states. War is increasingly everywhere. It is virtual, insofar as war is overlaid virtually as a layer, if you will, on top of the layer of human existence on the planet in globalization. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I'll try to elaborate that a little bit more. Because what I mean here is that and you see here my language on the slide, the inside-outside distinction has been blurred. We are post-realist. We fight wars now not between nation states, my inside and my outside, but we fight wars in the networks and in the channels of flows of globalization. I think that's key language here. Maybe I've just said the thing that I've been trying to figure out how to say. So if that's the case, then hopefully I've helped you a lot, because I think, sometimes we talk about globalization as being a networked phenomena that is a lot to do with interdependency, and interdependency is key here. We have a regime that we live in now that is able to bring us goods and services from all over the world. And yet we saw on 9/11 how easily that system of living, of global interdependency, was able to be counter-functioned by the terrorists as they turned civilian airliners into guided missiles and flew them into buildings. So this is kind of where we're at. We are fighting networked warfare now. We are fighting war that transcends the distinction between nation states and their borders. We are fighting wars that exist in the alleyways, in the slums, in the computer networks, in the aviation networks. And I think that's what Hart and Negri are trying to suggest when they say that politics is now war by other means. Because, and this is central to our understanding, if we go back to Foucault and biopower and biopolitics, that really what biopower is a kind of a model of arranging human existence such that life is abundant and overflowing. But the irony is that our technology has given us such things as weapons of mass destruction, and whether that's nuclear weapons or dirty radioactive bombs or chemical weapons, you name it, sarin gas in the Japanese subway, that kind of thing. There's all different kinds of weapons of mass destruction. That wars between nation states are clearly impossible anymore, because they would just destroy each other, and possibly the planet with it if the conflict was to go nuclear, and that's a real risk. So the Clausewitzian model of war is dead, really. And instead what we have is, instead of a disciplinary life, we have a life called biopower that's emerging to rule over life, to make us technologically efficient, to release our creative energies, to do all these wonderful things for us, and truly make life better in many many ways. But we also raise the question of its vulnerability in networks. And that's the question I think that Hart and Negri are asking here, and that's why they use the metaphor of the Russian Matryoshka doll reversed, where it used to be that the innermost layer of the Matryoshka doll was war, insofar as war was subordinate to the sovereignty of the nation state. Now war is the capsule, right, within which the nation state is contained. So the nation state is subordinate to war. Not war in the sense that Clausewitz knew of nation state versus nation state, but war in the sense of a society that, in its enthusiasm to live effectively, efficiently, and to flourish in networks, in globalization, is having to securitize itself. In other words, it's having to fundamentally carry out violence upon itself in order to secure itself, right? And also, and that's internally, but also in those parts of the world where empire is not yet fully in place, like in where we see what we call failed states, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, etc., that we would engage in nation building. And nation building is such an important term here, because it speaks exactly to the kind of sort of cynicism that Hart and Negri bring to their analysis of what's going on here. They believe that there's some good things going on in biopower, right? That it has the potential for the multitude, if the multitude ever choose to sort of take up biopower, they can use it as a weapon to overthrow empire, for sure, right? So that's good. The capacities of biopower, rather. But as things are, biopower is the handmaiden, if you will, of empire. And empire wants to see order above all. That's empire's primary thing. And empire wants to see order in the Western world, which is the world where violence is internalized within the liberal sphere of existence, creating this kind of hypocrisy where we are going to airports, we're living in freedom, but we're going to airports and taking off our shoes and being body scanned all the time, right? We are constantly, each and every one of us, under suspicion. That's what Hart and Negri's key point is there. It's the suspicion that we all live in under the Western world regime. But then elsewhere you see this pacifying war, right? This pacifying war taking place in the, shall we say, hinterland of empire, where we, for example, have the Kofi Annan doctrine that's mentioned on page 27, that is now not really relying on international law to justify itself, but rather relying on morality codes to justify wars and interventions after the fact. So that's kind of troubling for us, right? Because it means that the nation states, in their efforts and desire to serve empire's desire for order, are kind of playing fast and loose with the older categories of international law, which are increasingly being seen to be redundant anyway, because they were designed for conflict between nation states, not for conflict in networks. But the conflict in networks, the idea of risk that we all might be exposed to as we struggle to live in a world of insecurity, that clearly has broken international law. So in a way, I think one of the things that Hart and Negri are saying is kind of weird here, that empire doesn't see good guys or bad guys. It just sees disorder where there's disorder. It sees order and disorder. And where there's disorder, it wants order. But it wants this order with a religious fervor that we haven't really seen since before the modern era, right? This is in a way going back to the 100 Years' War, where people were committed to intervening inside other people's countries in order to bring about just outcomes. Today, just like then, we want just outcomes. Only the just outcomes are not religious. They are just outcomes defined in terms of the needs of a global humanity. And it is this kind of almost evangelical attitude of empire that I think Hart and Negri are really spooked by, and they're really worried by. And what's really cool about the argument that they're making is, that this is not an anti-American thing. This is not an anti-Western thing. Empire is a global phenomena closely associated with liberal democratic ideals and capitalist economic values. And within that, obviously, there's a lot of potential for good things to happen, but it's the kind of paternalistic attitude of the biopolitical world as it strives to globalize itself and implement itself everywhere that has them preoccupied. This idea that somehow security has become the paramount value as we seek to live in globalization that keeps order. And the sacrifices that we're willing to make in terms of our freedom and the freedom of others, that really worries Hart and Negri the most. So there you go, guys. That's an hour and 10 minutes commentary on Hart and Negri's Empire. Hopefully this file will upload, and we will be able to see each other in class on Wednesday to discuss. Okay, take care.